you had an interesting perspective here, and I think it's different than everyone else I've read so far on this case. So far, let's kind of start at the beginning before we get into the specifics of the legal case here.
Right.
Kind of the two positions you see thrown about is basically the Mueller report came out and it proves he did everything wrong, and the Mueller report came out and it proves that Trump did nothing wrong. So right off the start, where do you fall in that little range?
Well, maybe it's because I was a prosecutor for a long time. I think that it's always a mistake when we read either like a social phenomenon or a political phenomenon as a legal problem to be resolved by a prosecutor, because if that's what you're going to impose on a prosecutor, has basically one of two decisions to make. There's either enough evidence to charge or there's not. Mm-hmm. And when you decide that there's not, that doesn't mean that somebody's been exonerated. It might. Sometimes you do an investigation and you find not only that the person you were investigating didn't do it, but that somebody else did. So to a certainty that the person is not guilty, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's other times when you don't charge because in your bones that the guy did it, but you just can't prove it. You don't have enough evidence. So prosecutors, unlike Mueller's report, which I regard in this way as more of a spin document than a prosecutor's document. Prosecutors never say things like we won't exonerate him or we don't exonerate him. You either charge or you don't charge, and everything else is gray area. So I wouldn't run with a prosecutor saying I didn't find enough evidence to indict. I wouldn't run from that and say I've been exonerated. And when you look at what's in the reports, Stu, I don't know, a lot of that is pretty unsavory behavior. Now, none of it's been proved, and it's really against the normal protocols of the Justice Department and prosecutors' offices at every level to publish the information about somebody that you don't charge, because the rule of the road is if the government's going to charge someone or the government's going to accuse someone of wrongdoing, you have to do it formally so that the person then has the full array of protections that you get under the Constitution to defend yourself. So when the prosecutor goes out and says, here's all the terrible things I know that he did, oh, and by the way, we're not going to charge him, you've really smeared the person and not given them any opportunity to defend themselves, and that's not normally what's done. It was done here. I guess politically this report had to come out because there was no alternative. But I don't think I think if you're Trump, you want to say thank you and move on. I wouldn't be running around saying I've been exonerated because there's some icky stuff in there.
Yeah, and you get into some of that in your column for the New York Post. It's titled "Mueller Completely Dropped the Ball with the Obstruction Punt," and I want to get into how he dropped the ball. You mentioned Trump's interactions, first of all, on the negative side, with things like the McGahn situation, where he tried to get him fired, and then even went beyond that to try to convince him to lie about that he had called him to fire.
He tried to get Mueller fired.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You have that, and you also have some interesting perspective on the other side of this, because. And I think this ties to the most prominent thing that's come out of this as far as the media goes, which is this statement that Trump makes at one point where he says, this is the end of my presidency, I'm effed now that there's a council. Right. And you point out that the president's frustration wasn't over fear of guilt. That is a really important part of this, and I feel like most people have completely ignored it. In fact, cutting that out of the quote that has been proliferated so widely.
Yeah, well, it's funny with obstruction cases. You hear a lot in the commentary that if you have an obstruction, that you can't have an obstruction case unless there's an underlying crime, right? Mm-hmm. We've heard that again and again for the last few days, and that's with due respect to some of the people peddling that, it's just wrong. The classic example is. Bill Clinton, right? He didn't lie about what went on in the Oval Office because it was a crime. He lied about it because it would have been embarrassing and politically devastating for it to come out, right? So people lie for all kinds of reasons, but in certain factual contexts, it is true that if there's no underlying crime, then there doesn't really make much sense for why you would want to obstruct the investigation. And this, I think, was one of those situations. And what Trump was concerned about here was not that he would be found to be involved in an espionage conspiracy with Russia involving hacking of Democratic email accounts. I think he was obviously pretty confident that that hadn't happened. But he was concerned about being portrayed as an agent of the Kremlin, and about the fact that, when you have a president who's under a cloud of suspicion, it becomes very hard to govern. It becomes hard to recruit good people into the government. Who wants to go work for an administration? You're going to have to lawyer up the next week. It's pretty expensive stuff. So he's compromised in trying to assemble administration. He's compromised in dealing with Congress, foreign governments, you name it. And it's very frustrating. And we all know, the Lawrence Walsh investigation, that thing went on for about 8 years, So we didn't know when this started that Mueller, I think to his credit, was going to wrap it up in 22 months.